Millions watch the dance, but only he knows the weight. It left behind it was the kind of night that lingers in history books, not because of the grandeur or the powerful names in attendance, but because of a single quiet moment. The commander-in-chief. Ball was in full swing and all eyes were on the new First Lady Melania Trump. Dressed in a stunning white gown, she exuded grace as she made her way through the crowd. But what captured the hearts of millions wasn't just her poise. It was the man who took her hand for the first official dance. U.S. Army Sergeant John Davis wasn't used to being in the spotlight, a career soldier stationed at Fort Carson, Colorado. He was more accustomed to the hum of helicopters and the weight of his rucksack than to the glare of camera flashes. But on that night, standing in the heart of Washington, D.C., he became the face of countless service members across the nation. As the music swelled, John offered his hand to the First Lady. His movements were steady. His uniform immaculate to the audience, he seemed unshakable. But beneath the surface, his mind raced with thoughts. Was he representing his fellow soldiers? Well, would his steps falter in front of the nation? And above all, how had a soldier like him, just an ordinary man, found himself in such an extraordinary moment? But it wasn't just John's nerves that made this moment unforgettable. The world was watching, and in a nation deeply divided, this day became more than just a tradition. It became a symbol of unity. But what no one knew was how this fleeting moment would ripple through the rest of John's life, changing his future, testing his strength, and teaching him lessons he'd carry forever. The room was alive with anticipation, the air thick with the hum of conversation and the occasional clink of glasses. The Commander-in-Chief Ball wasn't just an event. It was a spectacle camp panned across the room, capturing military leaders, government officials, and dignitaries dressed in their finest. But as the MC's voice echoed across the grand hall, announcing the first dance of the evening, the crowd fell into a hushed anticipation. Standing off to the side, Sergeant John Davis adjusted his uniform for the 100th time. That night he could feel the weight of the room's attention, even though no one was looking at him yet. He took a deep breath, running through the steps in his mind. Right, left, pause. Keep your shoulders relaxed. Don't overthink it. Sergeant Davis, a voice called gently. Bringing him back to the moment, a protocol officer gestured toward the First Lady, who was now making her way toward him. Her steps were measured, her expression calm, though there was a softness to her smile that instantly eased some of the tension. Gripping his chest, he extended his hand as she approached, and she took it with a graceful nod. For a brief moment, the world seemed to blur. The cameras, the lights, the hundreds of people watching it all faded into the background. All that remained was the music and the rhythm of their movements. The song was soft and deliberate, a classic melody chosen for its elegance. John moved carefully, his every step. Guided by years of discipline, he could feel the smooth fabric of her gown brush against his uniform as they swayed across the floor. Her voice, quiet and kind, broke the silence between them. "Are you nervous?" she asked, her tone light but genuine. He let out a breath of a laugh, surprising even himself a little. He admitted, "But I think my training has me covered." Her laugh was quiet but warm, a shared moment of humanity in a room that often felt larger than life. "You're doing great," she said, and he couldn't help but believe her. The dance itself lasted no more than a couple of minutes, but to JN it felt both timeless and fleeting. Every step seemed to carry weight, beyond its simplicity, as though the entire room, perhaps even the entire nation, was leaning in, searching for something. In this moment, when the song ended, applause erupted. Around them, John released her hand, stepped back, and gave a sharp salute. His movements crisp and respectful. She returned the gesture with a small bow of her head, before turning back toward the stage. As John walked off the dance floor, his heart still pounding, he caught a glimpse of himself on one of the large screen scenes positioned around the hall. It was surreal seeing his own image projected to a crowd of thousands, knowing that millions more were watching from home. But little did he know, this brief dance was only the beginning of a journey that would test him in ways he could never have imagined. The applause still rang in John's ears as he stepped off the dance floor. The gravity of the moment settling into his chest, he tried to disappear into the crowd, but it was impossible everywhere. He turned, cameras flashed, and familiar faces extended their hands, offering congratulations and kind words. His fellow soldiers who had been stationed nearby gave him grins and claps on the back. "You look like you belonged up there, Davis," one of them said. His voice laced with pride, but belonging was the last thing John felt. As the night continued, his phone buzzed incessantly. Family and friends from his small hometown in Kansas were flooding him with messages. His mother texted, "I'm so proud of you, baby." His sister sent a blurry picture of him on TV with a caption, "Our very own hero," by the time he returned to his hotel room. Late that night, Johan felt like he had been swept into a whirlwind. He sat on the edge of the bed, still in his uniform, staring at his phone. Social media was ablaze with clips of the dance. News outlets called it a symbol of unity, and online comments ranged from admiration for his composure to debates over the deeper meaning of the moment. But amid the excitement, JN felt a tinge of unease. He had never sought the spotlight. He was a soldier, not a celebrity. His life was built on routine and purpose, not on the scrutiny of the public eye. And yet here he was, his name suddenly known by millions. The days that followed were surreal. At the base, fellow soldiers teased him, calling him Hollywood strangers, stopped him on the street to shake his hand, thanking him for his service. Local news stations requested interviews, and invitations to events began pouring in. He even received a handwritten letter from a retired general, commending him for his grace under pressure. At first, the attention felt like a novelty, but it didn't take long for the pressure to creep in. JN couldn't shake the feeling that he now carried the expectations of not just his fellow soldiers, but an entire nation. The dance had been a moment of joy and connection, but the spotlight that came with it felt heavy, almost suffocating. And yet what John didn't realize was that the true challenges were still ahead, waiting quietly for their turn to test his resolve. At first, the fame felt like a fleeting gust of wind, a rush of excitement that would pass quickly, but as weeks turned into months, Sergeant John Davis realized this wasn't going away. His face had become a symbol, and with it came a weight he wasn't prepared to carry. The first challenge was within his own ranks. While most of his fellow soldiers were supportive, a few couldn't hide their irritation. "Guess we're all just background players in the Sergeant Davis show." Now, one remarked during training, it was meant as a joke, but the sting of resentment was unmistakable. John brushed it off, focusing on his work. But the dynamics had shifted. He was no longer just another soldier. He was the guy who danced with Melania Trump. Then there was the media. Requests for interviews became relentless. A few journalists even tried digging into his personal life, looking for anything to sensationalize. He had to deal with headlines that twisted his words or exaggerated his actions. One article called him America's poster soldier, while another claimed he was handpicked as a political statement. Neither felt true, and yet both seemed to define him in the public eye. John tried to maintain a sense of normality, but it was impossible to ignore the impact on his family. His parents, proud but overwhelmed, found themselves fielding questions from neighbors and strangers. His younger brother, still in high school, began struggling with the sudden attention. "I'm proud of you," his brother said one evening, "but it's hard being John Davis's brother all the time." The turning point came during a public speaking event. John had been invited to share his story at a military appreciation dinner in Dallas. Standing in front of hundreds of people, he felt the familiar nerves creep in. But this wasn't like the dance. This time he had to speak not just with precision, but with meaning. As he told the story of that night, he could see the room hanging on his every word. And yet deep down he couldn't shake the thought that he was an imposter. He was just a soldier, doing what he'd been asked to do. What right did he have to stand there as a symbol of unity? of patriotism, of hope after the event. A woman approached him. She was older, perhaps in her 60s, and her eyes were brimming with tears. "My husband served in Vietnam," she said, her voice trembling. "He never got the recognition he deserved seeing you out there. It means the world to people like us." John thanked her, his throat tight with emotion, but as he walked away, her words stayed with him. He realized that this wasn't about him. It was about what he represented, something far bigger than himself. But even with this new perspective, Johan still struggled with the growing divide between the life he had known and the person the world wanted him to be. The more Johan tried to reconcile his growing public image with his personal identity, the more he realized how deeply the dance had reshaped his life. He began journaling, a habit he had picked up during deployments, to make sense of it all. Page after page, he poured out his thoughts. The pride he felt in representing his fellow soldiers, the doubt that gnawed at him, and the quiet moments when he longed for the anonymity he once had. What stood out most to him wasn't the dance itself, but what it represented for many. It had been a rare moment of connection. In a fractured time, the headlines and social media comments often described it as a symbol of unity. But John began to see it differently. To him, it wasn't just unity. It was a reminder of the humanity behind the uniforms, titles, and labels. He thought back to his deployment in Afghanistan years earlier, where he and his team had worked with local communities to rebuild schools. He remembered the conversations he had with the children, their laughter despite the hardships they faced. Those moments had always felt like the most meaningful parts of his service, far removed from medals or ceremonies. But now, with his newfound platform, he wondered if he could do more. Could he use this attention to shine a light on the everyday sacrifices of service members? Could he amplify the stories of those who never got the chance to dance on a stage or receive a standing ovation? John started saying yes to more opportunities to speak publicly, not because he enjoyed it, but because he felt a responsibility to share the stories of those who couldn't. He spoke at schools, veteran events, and even corporate gatherings, sharing not just his story, but the lessons he had learned about leadership, resilience, and service. One evening, after a particularly long event, a young man approached him. He was wearing a worn leather jacket and had the kind of nervous energy John recognized instantly. "I just wanted to say thanks," the man said, avoiding eye contact. "I've been struggling to find my purpose since getting out of the Marines. Hearing you talk tonight, it reminded me why I signed up in the first place." Johan shook the man's hand firmly. "You're not alone," he said. "None of us are." Just remember that moment stuck with him. It wasn't about grand gestures or perfect words. It was about showing up, being present, and reminding people that their stories mattered. But as John embraced this new role, he couldn't ignore the toll it took on him. And the lingering question remained: how could he honor the past while moving forward with his own life? As the years passed, John Davis found himself in a space he'd never anticipated, a bridge between worlds. He was still a soldier, at heart, with the same sense of duty that had guided him through deployments and long nights in the field. But now he was also a voice for something greater, carrying the weight of expectations from people who saw him as more than just a man in uniform. He often thought back to that dance and what it had taught him. It wasn't about the elegance of the moment or the symbolism the world attached to it. For John, it was about connection. Those fleeting seconds when two people from vastly different worlds shared a common space. It reminded him of a conversation he once had with his late grandfather. A Korean War veteran, his grandfather had always emphasized the importance of humility. "Your uniform doesn't make you better than anyone else," he said, "but it does remind you of the responsibility you carry for others." John carried that wisdom with him as he navigated his new reality. He used his platform not to elevate himself, but to shine a light on the stories of those who served alongside him, the ones whose sacrifices often went unnoticed. He became an advocate for veterans struggling to transition back into civilian life, and for the families who bore the weight of their absence. One of his proudest moments came years after the dance at a modest gathering in a community center in Topeka, Kansas. John had been invited to speak about his experiences, but instead of centering himself, he turned the spotlight on the veterans in the room he shared. Their stories of resilience, loss, and triumph. By the end of the evening, the room was filled with people offering each other support, exchanging numbers and forming connections after the event. A woman approached him with her teenage son. She explained how her husband had served in Iraq and struggled with PTSD before passing away. She held John's hand tightly, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Thank you for reminding people that, behind every soldier, there's a family. You're making a difference." John nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. Moments like this gave him clarity, reaffirming that his role wasn't about being a hero. It was about reminding people of the humanity behind every uniform. As he reflected on everything, the dance, the attention, the challenges, and the growth, he realized the greatest lesson he'd learned. It's not the moments of recognition that define you, but how you use those moments to lift others. For John, the dance with the First Lady had been a fleeting moment in the spotlight, but what came after was far more important. It had given him the chance to serve in a new way, to connect with people, and to carry forward the story of those who couldn't tell their own. As he looked ahead, John felt a deep sense of purpose. Life wasn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It was about showing up day after day for the people who mattered, and to anyone who found themselves in a moment of unexpected attention or responsibility. His advice was simple: don't waste it. Use it for good. If you've been moved by this story, remember that each of us has the power to create meaningful connections and make a difference, no matter how small the gesture may seem. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more stories that inspire and remind us of the best in humanity.